In the winter of 1943, deep in a concrete bunker outside Berlin, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer named Major Klaus Richter stared at a photograph that had just arrived from a reconnaissance flight over England. The image showed row after row after row of heavy bombers lined up on an airfield near Cambridge. He counted them once, then again. 47 aircraft, all identical, all new, all from a single factory run. But it wasn't the number that caught his attention, it was the machine itself. The bomber in the photograph was grotesque, almost comically ugly. It had a slab-sided fuselage that looked like a boxcar with wings. It had twin vertical stabilizers jutting up from the tail like rabbit ears, an awkward, ungainly solution to a design problem that German engineers would have solved with elegance. And those wings, dear God, those wings were impossibly thin and long, stretched so taut they looked like they might snap off in the first bit of turbulence. Richter turned to his colleague and made a remark that would be recorded in the margins of the intelligence file. "The Americans," he said with a dismissive laugh, "are sending us flying freight cars. If this is their best, the war is already won." He was looking at the B-24 Liberator, and he was catastrophically, fatally wrong. The story of how Germany learned this mistake, the specific moments when their contempt turned to terror, is one of the most profound lessons of industrial warfare ever recorded. And it begins not with a battle, but with a philosophy, a fundamental difference in how two nations understood the very purpose of design. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German military mind in 1941 was the product of centuries of Prussian excellence. When German engineers sat down to design a bomber, they approached it as craftsmen approaching a masterpiece. Every line had to be perfect. Every surface had to be aerodynamically pure. Their bombers, aircraft like the Heinkel He 111 or the Junkers Ju 88, were sleek, purposeful machines. They were beautiful in the way a katana is beautiful, form following function with an almost artistic precision. The Heinkel 111, for instance, featured a single vertical stabilizer, a graceful elliptical wing, and a fuselage shaped by hours of wind tunnel testing to minimize every ounce of drag. It was, by all measures, a better flying machine than the B-24 on a purely aerodynamic basis. It was faster in level flight. It handled more smoothly, and it looked like what a bomber should look like, purposeful and deadly. When German pilots and engineers first saw detailed photographs and captured examples of the American B-24 Liberator in late 1942, their reaction was almost universal derision. The design seemed to violate every principle of good aeronautical engineering that they held sacred. That twin-tail configuration, the thing Richter had mocked, was seen as an admission of failure. German designers had mastered the art of the single tail, using sophisticated stress calculations and careful design to create a vertical stabilizer that was both strong and elegant. The Americans, it seemed, couldn't figure out how to make a single tail work, so they just stuck two on. It was the aeronautical equivalent of using duct tape. The fuselage was even worse. Where German bombers featured carefully shaped, streamlined bodies that reduced drag and increased speed, the B-24 had what pilots called a slab-sided design. It was a straight-sided rectangular tube. It looked less like an aircraft and more like a railway cargo car that someone had accidentally given wings. There was no artistry to it, no grace. It was blunt, industrial, ugly. And then there was the wing, the Davis wing, as it was called, named after its designer David Davis, was one of the most unusual airfoils ever put on a major production aircraft. It was incredibly long and thin, with a very high aspect ratio. This gave the B-24 excellent fuel efficiency and range, But it also made the wing look fragile, almost delicate. To German eyes, accustomed to the thick, robust wings of their own bombers, it looked like a structural disaster waiting to happen. German test pilots who were given the opportunity to fly captured B-24 seconds in late 1942 confirmed what the engineers suspected. The plane was heavy and cumbersome on the controls. It didn't have the crisp, responsive handling of a Heinkel or a Junkers. It felt, in their words, like flying a truck. The landing gear was notoriously difficult. The tricycle configuration was still relatively new, and the B-24's nose gear was weak and prone to collapse if the landing wasn't perfect. German pilots used to tail-dragger aircraft found the whole thing awkward and unnatural. Their conclusion was simple and, they believed, entirely justified by the evidence. The B-24 was a second-rate bomber, an inferior design rushed into production by a nation that didn't understand the finer points of aircraft design. It was proof, once again, that American engineering was about crude mass production, not precision or quality. They were building these ugly, poorly designed machines in vast numbers. Yes, but numbers alone, the Germans reassured themselves, could not make up for fundamental inferiority. What the Germans didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, from within their own tradition of craftsmanship and perfection, was that every single flaw they were mocking was actually a deliberate choice, and each choice was made with a purpose that had nothing to do with aerial beauty and everything to do with a uniquely American approach to industrial war. The twin-tail design wasn't an admission of failure, it was a stroke of brutal practicality. A single, large vertical stabilizer, while elegant, requires an enormous, vertical structural member running through the fuselage. This member has to be incredibly strong to handle the aerodynamic loads, which means it's heavy. More importantly, it takes up valuable space in the bomber's fuselage, space that could be used for fuel, bombs, or crew positions. The twin-tail configuration allowed Consolidated Aircraft, the company that designed the B-24, to eliminate that massive structural member. Instead, they mounted two smaller vertical stabilizers on the horizontal stabilizer booms. This freed up the entire rear fuselage. It allowed them to install twin machine gun turrets in the tail for defense, and it created a completely unobstructed bomb bay that ran nearly the entire length of the fuselage. The B-24 could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs in a single cavernous bay. German bombers with their elegant single tails were limited to much smaller, divided bomb bays. The slab-sided fuselage that looked so crude and ugly served an even, more important purpose. That rectangular cross-section could be built using flat aluminum sheets, bent at simple 90-degree angles. Compare this to the German approach, which required compound curves and complex forming dies. Every single inch of a Heinkel's fuselage had to be carefully shaped by skilled workers. The B-24's fuselage could be built by semi-skilled workers in a matter of hours using simple tools and jigs. This wasn't laziness. This was genius. This was Henry Ford's assembly line philosophy applied to a 10-ton bomber, and that supposedly fragile Davis wing, the one that looked like it would snap in the first storm, was actually one of the most efficient lifting surfaces ever designed. Its high aspect ratio meant that it generated enormous lift with relatively little drag. This gave the B-24 a range of over 2,000 miles when fully loaded, far superior to comparable German bombers. Yes, it was more difficult to build and required precise manufacturing. But once built, it allowed the B-24 to fly farther and carry more bombs than any bomber the Germans had. But here's the critical thing the Germans missed entirely. None of these design choices were made to create the best bomber in a traditional sense. They were made to create a bomber that could be built in absolutely staggering, world-breaking numbers by ordinary workers in ordinary factories across America. and that distinction would prove to be everything. In 1941, the United States had made a decision that would reshape the entire global conflict. They were going to build bombers not in the hundreds, not in the thousands, but in quantities that defied all precedent. And to do that, they needed a design that could be mass-produced like automobiles. The man who understood this best was Henry Ford. In 1942, Ford's engineers began constructing what would become the largest single manufacturing facility in the world, the Willow Run plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan. The building was over a mile long. Inside, they created an assembly line that could take raw aluminum at one end and roll out a completed B-24 Liberator bomber at the other end every 63 minutes at peak production. To put that in perspective, a traditional aircraft factory in Germany might produce 2 or 3 bombers a week. Willow Run alone was producing more than 500 bombers a month by mid-1943, and Willow Run wasn't even the only plant building B-24 seconds. Consolidated had factories in San Diego and Fort Worth. Douglas Aircraft had a plant in Tulsa. North American had a facility in Dallas. All told, American industry would build 18,482 B-24 Liberators between 1940 and 1945. That's more heavy bombers than Germany, Britain, and Japan built combined during the entire war. It's a number so vast that it challenges comprehension. If you lined up every B-24 ever built wingtip to wingtip, they would stretch for over 200 miles. German intelligence knew these numbers. They had agents in America. They had access to shipping records and production reports. Major Richter and his colleagues in Berlin read these figures and simply refused to believe them. They assumed they were propaganda, inflated numbers designed to intimidate. The idea that America could build bombers faster than Germany could build fighters seemed to violate the basic laws of industrial capacity. But the numbers were real, and in the summer of 1943, the German Luftwaffe was about to learn exactly what 18,000 bombers looked like when they arrived over the fatherland. The first major deployment of B-24 Liberator groups to England began in late 1942. These weren't the polished, veteran crews. They were young American kids, most of them barely out of high school, who had been given a few months of training and sent across the Atlantic. The early missions were small, tentative probing raids against targets in occupied France. The German fighter pilots who intercepted these formations found them to be exactly what they expected: clumsy, poorly flown, and vulnerable. A Luftwaffe pilot named Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, who would later become famous for an act of chivalry over Germany, recorded his impressions after his first engagement with B-24 seconds in early 1943. "The American bomber is a great lumbering beast," he wrote in his diary. "It flies in straight lines, makes no evasive maneuvers, and its gunners fire wildly without discipline. They are brave, but untrained. We shot down 3 in a single pass." This confidence held through the spring of 1943. The Luftwaffe, still one of the most formidable air forces in the world, was winning its engagements with the American bomber streams. Yes, the Americans kept coming, kept sending more planes, but they were also losing planes at an unsustainable rate. In some early raids, losses exceeded 10% of the attacking force. No air force could sustain that kind of attrition. The German fighter pilots developed effective tactics. They learned to attack the B-24 from the front, where its defensive armament was weakest. They learned to target the wing route, where a well-placed cannon burst could sever the fuel lines or structural spars. And they learned that if you could knock out the lead bomber in a formation, the rest would often scatter or abort. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to change. The American crews were learning. They were getting better. The formations were getting tighter, making it harder to single out individual bombers. The defensive gunnery was improving, and most importantly, the sheer number of bombers appearing over Germany was increasing week after week after week. By the summer of 1943, a typical American raid might involve 50 or 60 B-24 seconds, accompanied by an equal number of B-17 flying fortresses. By autumn, that number had grown to 150 to 200 bombers in a single mission. The math was becoming unavoidable. Even if the Luftwaffe shot down 10 or 15 bombers, 140 still made it through to the target, and then came the missions that broke the German faith entirely. The missions where the sky turned black with American bombers, where the formations stretched for mile after mile after mile, where German pilots, climbing to intercept, simply ran out of ammunition before they ran out of targets. The first time this happened, truly happened at a scale that made it undeniable, was during Big Week in February of 1944. Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, was a coordinated series of American bombing missions launched between February 19th and February 25th, 1944. The strategic goal was simple and brutal: destroy Germany's ability to build fighter aircraft. The execution was unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. On the morning of February 20th, over 1,000 American heavy bombers, escorted by nearly 900 fighter aircraft, took off from bases across England, the sky filled with the thunder of thousands of engines. Formation after formation assembled over the English countryside, and then, like a vast metallic river, they flowed east across the Channel toward Germany. German radar operators watching their screens thought at first that their equipment was malfunctioning. The number of returns, the sheer density of aircraft on their scopes, seemed impossible. One operator at a coastal station reportedly called his commanding officer and said, "Sir, either our radar has failed completely, or the entire American Air Force is heading directly for us." It was the latter. The Luftwaffe scrambled every available fighter. They threw everything they had at this massive formation. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighter wings from across Germany converged on the bomber stream. And for hours, the sky over Central Europe became a scene of industrial slaughter on a scale never before witnessed. German fighter pilots attacked with suicidal bravery. They dove through walls of defensive machine gun fire. They pressed their attacks to point-blank range, and they did score kills. American bombers, both B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, fell from the sky trailing smoke and fire. But here's what shattered German confidence. For every bomber they shot down, 2 more took its place in the formation. A Luftwaffe pilot named Major Heinz Knoke, a veteran of over 200 combat missions, recorded his experience attacking a formation of B-24 Liberators on the second day of Big Week. "I made 3 passes," he wrote. "On my first attack, I destroyed 1 bomber. I saw it fall away with its wing on fire. On my second pass, I damaged another, but my ammunition was running low. On my third pass, my cannon jammed. I had to break off. As I dove away, I looked back at the formation. The gap where the bomber I had shot down had been was already filled. The formation was still perfect, still flying straight toward the target. It was as if my attack had never happened. I felt, for the first time, that we were fighting not an air force, but a machine, an unstoppable machine." Over the course of Big Week, the Americans flew nearly 3,400 heavy bomber sorties. They dropped over 10,000 tons of bombs on German aircraft factories in Leipzig, Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had at these raids. They shot down 137 American bombers and damaged hundreds more. Under normal circumstances, under the old rules of aerial warfare, this would have been considered a catastrophic defeat for the attackers. Losses of that magnitude should have forced the Americans to suspend operations for weeks, perhaps months, to rebuild their strength. But the old rules no longer applied. Within 72 hours, every single bomber lost during Big Week had been replaced. Brand new B-24 seconds and B-17 seconds, fresh from the factories in Michigan and Texas and California, were already on their way to England. The crews who had been lost, and this is perhaps even more remarkable, were replaced just as quickly. The American training pipeline was producing fully qualified bomber crews at a rate of over 1,500 per month. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, lost 235 fighter aircraft during Big Week, along with 141 pilots killed or seriously wounded. These losses were irreplaceable. Germany's aircraft factories, the very targets of the American raids, had been heavily damaged. Production of Bf-109s dropped by 35% in March. The training schools for new pilots had been cut back due to fuel shortages. Every experienced pilot lost was a pilot that Germany simply could not replace. The German High Command did the math, and the conclusion was inescapable. They were losing a war of attrition in the air, and they were losing it to an enemy who could absorb losses that would have destroyed any other nation, simply because that enemy could build bombers faster than Germany could build fighters to shoot them down. But the true horror, the thing that kept German generals awake at night, wasn't just the quantity of bombers. It was what those bombers could do when they reached their targets. The B-24 Liberator, for all its ungainly appearance, was an extraordinarily capable weapons platform. That cavernous bomb bay, the one made possible by the twin-tail design the Germans had mocked, could carry either 8,000 pounds of bombs in a single load, or, with modifications, a single massive Grand Slam or tallboy bomb weighing up to 12,000 pounds. When formations of 150 or 200 B-24 seconds converged on a target, they didn't just damage it, they obliterated it from existence. The standard tactics called for the lead bombardier to mark the target, and then for every bomber in the formation to release their bombs on his signal. This created a bomb pattern called a carpet, a rectangular area of overlapping explosions that was, quite literally, impossible to survive if you were underneath it. German industrial centres began to simply cease to exist. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, facilities that had taken years to build and equip with precision machinery, were reduced to fields of rubble in a matter of minutes. The aircraft engine factories in Leipzig were hit so many times that workers stopped even trying to rebuild them. They just dug new workshops underground. But it was in the oil fields of Ploesti, Romania, where the B-24 Liberator truly proved what it had been designed to do. And it was there that the Germans learned a final, terrible lesson about American industrial warfare. Ploesti was the single most important source of oil for the German war machine. Nearly 60% of Germany's fuel came from the refineries clustered around this Romanian city. Without Ploesti, the Wehrmacht's tanks would be immobilized. The Luftwaffe's fighters would be grounded. The war would be over. The Germans knew this. They had fortified Ploesti with more anti-aircraft guns per square mile than any other target in Europe, including Berlin. Over 200 heavy flak guns and hundreds of light automatic weapons ringed the refineries. Barrage balloons floated overhead, their cables designed to tear the wings off any low-flying bomber. German and Romanian fighter squadrons were stationed nearby. It was considered the most heavily defended target in the world, and the Americans had to attack it because Ploesti was the beating heart of the German fuel supply, and if they could destroy it, they could cripple the entire Nazi war machine. The first major raid on Ploesti happened on August 1, 1943, and it was carried out almost entirely by B-24 Liberators. This wasn't a high-altitude precision bombing raid. The planners knew that from 30,000 feet, the refineries would be too small and too difficult to hit accurately, so they made an extraordinary decision. They would attack at low altitude. The B-24 would come in at treetop level, below the German radar, and bomb the refineries from less than 500 feet. This was suicide. The bomber crews knew it. The pilots knew it. Everyone involved knew it. But the mission went ahead anyway. 177 B-24 Liberators took off from bases in Libya in the early morning darkness. They flew north across the Mediterranean, staying low to avoid detection. As they crossed into Romanian airspace, they descended even further, until they were blowed, skimming just 50 feet above the sun-baked fields. The lead navigator on that mission was a young lieutenant named John Palm. In his post-mission report, which has been preserved in the National Archives, he described what he saw as his formation approached the target. "We came over the last ridgeline," he wrote. And there it was. Ploesti. Miles and miles of refineries, storage tanks, and cracking towers, and all of it defended by more guns than I had ever seen in my life. The sky ahead of us was already black with flak. I remember thinking, very clearly, that we were all going to die. The B-24 roared into Ploesti at 300 miles per hour, just barely above the rooftops. German gunners, shocked by bombers attacking at such low altitude, opened fire with everything they had. Automatic cannons, machine guns, even soldiers with rifles were shooting at the American planes. The noise was described by survivors as beyond anything they had ever experienced, a continuous roar of engines and explosions and screaming metal. The bombers flew directly over their targets and released their bombs. At that altitude, with almost no time for the bombs to arm, some of them bounced off the ground before exploding. Others went off directly beneath the bombers that had just dropped them, blowing the aircraft apart with their own payload. Massive fireballs erupted as fuel storage tanks exploded. Entire refineries disappeared in walls of orange flame. The B-24, those supposedly fragile, poorly designed aircraft, flew directly through this inferno. They flew through smoke so thick that pilots couldn't see their own wingtips. They flew through explosions that tossed 60,000-pound aircraft around like toys. They flew through fields of tracers and flak that looked, in the words of one survivor, like flying through the 4th of July. Out of 177 B-24 that attacked Ploesti that day, 54 were shot down. Hundreds more limped back to Libya, with battle damage, some so severe that they crashed on landing. 532 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. As a percentage of attacking forces, it was one of the bloodiest missions in the history of the Army Air Forces. But the refineries burned. For weeks afterward, satellite reconnaissance showed massive columns of black smoke rising from Ploesti. German oil production from Romania dropped by 46% in August and never fully recovered. The mission, despite its horrific cost, had been a success. And here's what broke the German understanding of American willpower. The Americans came back, not in weeks or months, but in days. Fresh crews, flying brand new B-24 attacked Ploesti again on August 10th, then again on August 24th, then again in September, October, November. They came back 15 times over the next year. Each raid cost them planes and men, and each time those losses were replaced almost immediately. A German officer stationed at Ploesti, a Major Wilhelm Schenk, wrote in his diary in November of 1943, "Today the Americans came again. They lost 11 bombers over the target. We celebrated, thinking we had bloodied them enough to make them stop. But our intelligence officer just received a report. The Americans are already planning the next raid, scheduled for 3 days from now. How is this possible? How can they continue to attack when they know what it costs them? We destroyed 11 of their bombers today. By the day after tomorrow, 11 new bombers will arrive in England to replace them. This is not war as we understand it. This is industrial slaughter, and we are on the wrong side of the mathematics. The Germans were right to be afraid, because by 1944, the production of B-24 Liberators had reached a pace that seemed to mock the very concept of scarcity. At peak production in early 1944, American factories were completing one B-24 every 44 minutes. Think about that. Every 44 minutes, somewhere in America, a 10-ton bomber rolled off an assembly line, fully equipped, fully armed, ready for war. The Luftwaffe's fighter production, by comparison, was being systematically destroyed by the very bombers they were trying to stop. In March of 1944, Germany produced 1,200 Bf-109 fighters. By July, after months of sustained American bombing, that number had fallen to 830. By September, it was down to 612. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Even if the Luftwaffe achieved a kill ratio of 2-to-1, shooting down 2 American bombers for every German fighter lost, they were still losing the war. Because America could replace those 2 bombers in 90 minutes, Germany couldn't replace that single fighter for weeks. German pilots, even the aces, the men with dozens of kills to their names, began to speak quietly, among themselves about the futility of what they were doing. A Luftwaffe pilot named Johannes Steinhoff, who would survive the war with 176 confirmed victories, wrote in his memoirs about a conversation he had with a fellow pilot in the summer of 1944. "We were sitting in our dispersal hut," Steinhoff wrote, waiting for the alarm to scramble. "My friend turned to me and said, 'Do you know what I saw yesterday? I saw a formation of American bombers, B-24 seconds, stretching from horizon to horizon. I counted 50 of them, then gave up. There were too many. I attacked one. I shot it down. And you know what happened? Nothing. The formation didn't even waver. They just closed up the gap and kept flying. It was as if I hadn't been there at all.' He paused, then said quietly, 'We are not fighting pilots anymore. We are fighting a factory, and you cannot shoot down a factory.' That sentiment, that creeping realization of helplessness, spread through the Luftwaffe like a disease. Pilots who had once been confident, even arrogant, became fatalistic. They still fought bravely, they still pressed their attacks home, but they no longer believed they could win. The final revelation came on March 6, 1945, during the first daylight raid on Berlin by the 8th Air Force. Over 1,200 American heavy bombers, more than half of them B-24 Liberators, escorted by 700 P-51 Mustang fighters, appeared over the German capital. A German civilian named Margaret Doos, who lived in Berlin and kept a detailed diary throughout the war, recorded what she saw that day. "I looked up," she wrote, "and the sky was gone. In its place was a ceiling of bombers. They stretched from one side of the horizon to the other, flying in perfect formations, their contrails creating a grid across the sky like a terrible geometric pattern. The sound was like continuous thunder. I stood in my garden and tried to count them. 100, 200, 300. I gave up. There were too many to count. I realized at that moment that we had lost the war, not because our soldiers were defeated, but because we were facing an enemy that could darken the sky itself with its machines." Over the next 2 months, before the war in Europe ended, the Americans would fly similar massive raids every few days. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Leipzig, Cities across Germany were hammered by thousands of tons of bombs. And the B-24 Liberator, that ugly, supposedly inferior bomber, was present in every single raid. By the time Germany surrendered in May of 1945, the B-24 had flown over 320,000 combat sorties in Europe alone, dropping more than 635,000 tons of bombs. It had destroyed German factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and marshalling yards. It had, quite literally, demolished the industrial capacity that had made the German war machine possible. The cost had been terrible. Over 4,700 B-24 seconds were lost in combat over Europe. Thousands more were damaged beyond repair or lost in training accidents. But every single one of those losses had been replaced. The factory at Willow Run alone built over 8,600 B-24 seconds. The production system that the Germans had mocked as inefficient and crude had simply overwhelmed them through sheer volume. After the war, Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German military leaders about their strategic assessments. One of the most revealing interviews was with General Adolf Galland, who had commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter forces. When asked what single factor had been most decisive in Germany's defeat in the air war, Galland gave a one-word answer: production. He elaborated, "We were told that the American bomber was inferior. We were told it was ugly, poorly designed, structurally weak, and in many technical respects this was true. The B-24 was not as elegant as our bombers. It was not as pleasant to fly, but it had one quality that made all other qualities irrelevant. It could be built in infinite numbers. When we shot down a B-24, the Americans built 3 more. When we destroyed a factory making them, they built 2 new factories. We were trying to win a war using craftsmanship and quality. They were winning a war using volume and mathematics. And in war, mathematics always wins." The legacy of the B-24 Liberator is complex and often misunderstood. In the decades after the war, aviation historians and enthusiasts tended to prefer the B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-17 was prettier, it had a more romantic name. It looked like what people thought a bomber should look like. The B-24, by contrast, was still ugly. It still looked industrial and workmanlike. But the numbers tell a different story. More B-24 seconds were built than any other American military aircraft in history. More B-24 seconds served in more theaters of war than any other heavy bomber. And the B-24 dropped more bombs on the Axis powers than any other aircraft, Allied or otherwise. That ugly, supposedly inferior design had accomplished exactly what it was intended to accomplish. It had brought American industrial might to bear on the enemies of freedom in the most overwhelming, devastating way imaginable. It had proven that in modern warfare, the ability to produce weapons matters more than the elegance of the design. It had taught the world that mass production, that uniquely American innovation, could be a weapon as powerful as any bomb or bullet. The workers at Willow Run, those men and women who had spent years building B-24 seconds in that mile-long factory, probably never knew the full impact of their work. They never saw the skies over Berlin blackened by their bombers. They never heard the conversations in German bunkers as officers realized they were defeated. They just came to work, day after day, and built airplanes. But those airplanes, 18,482 of them, changed the course of human history. They proved that a democracy, when roused to action, could outproduce and overwhelm any dictatorship. They proved that American industrial capacity, that ability to organize vast resources and produce on a scale that defied imagination, was the ultimate strategic weapon of the 20th century. Major Klaus Richter, the intelligence officer who had laughed at the photograph of the B-24 inches 1943, survived the war. In 1947, he was interviewed by an American military historian. The historian showed him that same photograph, the one of 47 B-24 seconds, lined up on an airfield in England. Richter stared at it for a long moment, then spoke quietly. "I remember this photograph," he said. "I remember thinking they looked like freight cars. I thought we would sweep them from the sky. Do you know how many B-24 seconds I saw shot down during the war? Hundreds, maybe thousands. And do you know what happened? More came. They always came. If I could go back and speak to my younger self, the man who laughed at this photograph, I would tell him one thing. Do not count the bombers in the photograph. Count the factories that built them, because that is what we were really fighting, and that is a fight we could never win." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.